unaussprechlichen Ramble.
They're talking about the Big Dipper, and the reason they're talking about it is because it's circumpolar. It never sets below the horizon. It's always there. It is the perfect symbol for immortality.
Hello, and welcome to another special episode of the most unpronounceable podcast ever. This time, I want to share a discussion between the legendary Peter Levenda, one of my first guests in Season 1, myself, and the UFO Twitter community, hosted by the bubbly Hollywood of Project Nano. We talk of celestial ascent, the nature of the others, the intersection between magic and ufology, and of course, Stairway to Heaven, the course Peter and I will teach in February and March 2024. We also answer a lot of questions. This conversation was originally recorded on Twitter Space, known for its constant bugs, like the rest of the platform nowadays, unfortunately. So apologies for the audio quality here and there. And now, on with the unspeakable Ramble.
Yes, we got there, guys. I've been very thrilled and honoured to be able to host this space now that we're here, and to have my friend Marco and my friend to be, now that I offer the world's best introductions, Peter Levenda. So, I don't want to keep everyone waiting too long. You know, we've got a lot of people in the space. This is a recorded space. I'm here with my friend and co-host, John. Just a bit of housekeeping from my side. There are no fire alarms or fire drills planned. Hopefully, no apocalyptic conditions. We will have a conversation with both Peter and Marco, and we hopefully will get to some questions. I know there will be a lot. So without further ado, I feel like I'm backtracking ever so slightly, so do forgive me. We may have to repeat some things, but yeah, very honoured to be here, and it is in conversation with them both. And yeah, let's dive into it. I really wanted to cover Peter's and Marco's current collaboration, Stairway to Heaven, which Marco very kindly, during our little melee there, touched on. But for me, you know, Marco and Peter, they don't take much of an introduction. Many of us will be very familiar with their work. So I'm not going to waste any more time. I think we've got them both for about an hour and a half, give or take. Very interesting, Peter. I was just saying to Marco, I'm reading Secret Machines again at the moment, very serendipitously. So I do feel a bit of extra that we're in the space together. So there we go. So let's jump into it. If people do have questions, either drop them into the nest. We'll get to what we can when we can. But I would love to know, let's dial it right back. We both know you great authors. We both, well, the space would probably know a lot about certainly your background, as well as yours, Marco. But I'd really like to dial it back to really what inspired you, Peter, to explore the realms of can't even get words out. What got you into this world? What got you into exploring these different realms? What was the driving force in you?
That's really hard to say. I have to go back really very far to figure that out. Probably I was a teenager. I had always been attracted to the Halloween kind of holidays as opposed to the Christmas and Easters. And but be that as aside, I came across a comic book of all things many years ago. I mean, I was about, let's not go into too many details. I was about 13 years old or so, or 13 or 14 years old. I came across a comic book that had a depiction in it of a sort of an occult ritual. It was a drawing. It was a typical comic book panel, and the guy was standing in the middle of a circle, and he had candles, and there were weird symbols and everything, and he was invoking something, and that just struck a chord. It was just this strange identification with that image, with that symbol, and trying to understand what that was all about. It was always there in the back of my mind. And I started to get Fate magazine regularly, which in those days was a small tabloid kind of magazine, like the size of our Reader's Digest. And it was all full of supernatural stuff. But the articles were not that interesting. But what was interesting was the classified section in the back. So I would send away for everything free that I could find. I was a kid, I had no money, and so I sent away for free stuff, and you would get pamphlets in the mail on how to conduct a seance, or how to use a Ouija board, or what incenses or candles to burn for various things. And that's sort of got me, I guess, on the path. And we had moved from the city when I was that age in '63 to it was kind of a haunted house. It was a house on a hill, very remote in a small town in New Hampshire. And we were city people, and now suddenly, my parents had this weird idea they were going to build a motel in the middle of nowhere. So here we are in this small town. We're on top of a hill. There are no neighbors for miles, and I literally had to walk miles to get to a bus to go to school in the morning. And it was just a weird place. And as we found out later, it appeared that the guy who had owned the house, two owners before us, had most likely killed his wife and child and buried them on the premises. And I was the one who found the graves, quite by accident.
Wow.
There were rumors that he had killed them, and it was even mentioned in the town records that one day simply they just weren't seen again. And the guy was kind of a crank. They had taken his horses. He had prized Morgan horses, but they had TB. They were taken in a TB test and they were killed. So he was very bitter about that. And they were running electrical lines across his property, and he was very bitter about that. So he became very, eccentric, and kept a shotgun, and nobody could come close to the house. And eventually he died, and they took over the property. And I was wandering around. We had more than 200 acres, and I literally stumbled into, two slabs of granite stuck into the earth, and came back and told my parents, and they called the local people, and they said, in their typical New Hampshire dialects, they're saying, that's probably old Percy. That's where he put his wife and daughter. And I'm thinking, don't you want to dig them up and find out? No, no need. They're already dead. It's weird kind of sentiments they had.
Wow.
So, and one other thing is that I found the place where they put the power lines. There was a clearing in this dense forest in New Hampshire, a very Lovecraftian kind of atmosphere. And suddenly there's this beautiful clearing in the middle of it where the power lines are running. And it was deadly quiet. Now, if you've been in the forests in New Hampshire, it's a noisy place. There's all kinds of creatures making noises, insects, birds, squirrels, all sorts of stuff going on. But suddenly you're in an area that's completely dead quiet. I mean, no sound whatsoever. And it was so creepy. I felt, the presence of something very large and very menacing. So I just turned around and ran back to the house. And that was like the beginning of it. And we left there soon after. We went back to the Bronx, where I'm from, and I started getting books on occultism and books on ceremonial magic. And there was a book club, it's kind of from University Books in those days, which sold A.E. Waite's book on ceremonial magic and some of the other standard things. And I was reading that and, trying to figure out how to do all that stuff, how to do all the ceremonial magic. And Waite's book is not very good for that. It's just, he gives you bits and pieces, and then he poo-poos the whole thing as he's doing it. And he sort of takes the wind out of your sails. And then one day, accidentally, I see an ad in the back of the New York Times for Weiser's bookstore. And in Manhattan, the old Weiser's, which sold a lot of secondhand books, and they had a downstairs room, which is where they had all the occult books and what they called the Orientalia. And that's where I found a copy of Aleister Crowley's Magic in Theory and Practice. And I thought, this is exactly what I need. This will tell me everything I need to know. Boy, was I wrong. But still, the book was, it was great because the attitude, the scientific approach to the whole subject in the book is what really attracted me. Like, this guy knows what he's talking about. He's explaining it probably the best way he can. And so I became very interested in all of that. And I said, okay, well, there's a route, there's a pathway into all of this. And we had seances in the house in the Bronx, and we had all the paranormal phenomena that went with it. We had the table tapping, the whole Victorian, experience, with the table lifting off the floor and then slamming back down in knocks, and the candle flames reaching up several feet and all of that. So at the same time, I'm going to high school and I'm taking science classes, because I'm trying to get an academic high school diploma. And what I'm learning in the science classes is not what I'm learning at home at the seance table. There's two different worlds there. They're in competition now. And if I told, the science teachers what I was experiencing, they'd probably call Child Protective Services or something and have me removed.
Right.
So that was the beginning of a kind of a double life where you know that there is something very serious on the other side, of the reality we're used to. Not to say that science isn't true, because it is also, but what's going on in this other realm is different, and so you start walking a tightrope between the two things. And so that's a long-winded response to your question of how I got involved in it, but that pretty much covers the high points.
A fabulous response, Peter. And I'll just pick up on some wording you said there. Double worlds, or walking between them. Growing up, my mum was massively into the occult, and we lived a very different life at home to the life that we kind of led outwardly. And it's just quite interesting to hear someone with your background and expertise say something that's very familiar to me. I had two very different experiences. I had a very magical, with a K perhaps, life at home, and was exposed to a lot of things that maybe my peers wouldn't. They were busy eating Cocoa Pops, watching children's TV, so that spoke to me, certainly. Okay, so we've got a bit of background, and Marco very kindly touched a little bit on it as we were sorting the space out. How did you? Marco mentioned that you guys started speaking around sort of towards lockdown, I think it was. Did you say, Marco? It'd be great
a few years before, but then we really start talking
Hello?
over the lockdowns. Yeah.
So maybe hi, can you hear us?
Yes, I'm here.
Peter? Yeah. So it would just be great. We touched on, you guys are collaborating on Stairway to Heaven, this upcoming course, which starts on the 2nd of February. I'd love if you both could give, why have you decided to do this course together?
Okay. You want to go first?
You go right ahead, Mark. I think it was your idea, actually.
Well, so I think it should be obvious by now that the point where me and Peter met was this shared interest for the occult and magic, right? And it also, another thing that we have in common is our interest in the contacting the numinous, if we want to call it like that, right? And something that became obvious, by reading, Peter's book Secret Machines, of course, and seeing his work with To the Stars, is that he was pushing, really, at least it was obvious to me, at least it was really pushing to try and present to the UFO UAP community this idea that there must be something more than the mere nuts and bolts theory about the visitations from this non-human intelligence, right, and the fact that this is something that I knew, that I know already. Everybody who's a magician, everybody who's been, consistently working these practices for as long as I have. I'm nearing 30 years now. I'm that old as well. So, the point is that, like, after a while, it is obvious that that's what you must do. That's what we as human beings must do. We must open channels of communications with non-human intelligences. Okay, and the idea that this is impossible to do unless we we wait for a spacecraft to land, and have a physical connection with these non-human intelligences, for me it was and still is preposterous, because lo and behold, magicians have been speaking with these intelligences since the beginning of human history, like possibly even before recorded human history, if anybody is keen on believing that maybe there's more to human history that we have recorded, right? It's always been there. There's always, like, we always done that. That's what humans do. Like, in order to possibly to make sense of our human experience, we talk to spirits, we talk to gods, we talk to, well, lo and behold, aliens. Like, we should always remember that words have power, and alien really comes from the Latin alienus, which means external. So an alien, a non-human intelligence, is everything that's external to the human experience, but still there. These aggregates of consciousness exist, and something that I really loved about Secret Machines. Uh, and it's something that I loved instinctively, and then Peter explained it to me, and I was like, okay, I was on the right track. Like, why is Secret with the K, right? Secret Machines, because Peter and Tom DeLong, in fact, they're speaking about, spiritual machines. They might have I don't know what that was, by the way. It was a huge bang here. There might be anyway a physical component of these visitations, but the spiritual component is as important. And so, like, was something that we realized we could teach it. We could teach the people. At least we could tell people where to look for, in order for everybody to come to their own, to establish their own context and their own, I like to use the term establishing an embassy with the other, right? But that's possible to do. And then, another thing came to me is that, what, Peter already did it, because Stairway to Heaven is a very thorough academic study of what it's called celestial ascent. Okay. And I guess this is where I can stop and then pass the ball to you.
Okay. Yeah,
I
that was
loved that. I loved that. I didn't actually. I didn't know about the K in Secret Machines, so my mind is a bit blown, Mr. Levenda.
well, and rightfully so. Well, the K actually, that was Tom's idea. Okay, he said, we're going to spell secret. We're going to spell it with a K, because with a K, it's a bit more street somehow, And I thought to myself, no, this is brilliant actually, because the K, of course, Marco would vibrate immediately to the K, because you put a K at the end of magic and it means something entirely different. So we put a K in secret and it means something different. And I realized that the word in Greek for secret is mystikos. And mystikos is also where we get the word mystic. So it's a mystical machine as well as a machine that is secret, that has a propulsion system that we don't understand, that comes from someplace we don't know, that is piloted, if it's piloted, by beings, if they are beings that we don't know, that we don't understand. So it's a machine, it's something physical, it's something that we see, it's something that shows up when it wants to, but it's also mysterious at the same time. So it's a secret machine with all that the word secret implies, which could mean mystical, which could mean otherworldly. So the whole idea of the celestial ascent is something that I was starting on before I met Tom, before we got involved in this. And it was actually, it's my master's thesis in religious studies. So I was writing on celestial ascent from that perspective. And as I was doing the research for the book Stairway to Heaven, which became the master's thesis, I came across, the Merkava mysticism, the descenders to the chariot, the basis of a very early form of Jewish mysticism that predates the Kabbalah. And if you look at the first chapter of Ezekiel, the book of Ezekiel in the Bible, he has this very famous vision. Everybody talks about it. It's what gave Merkava mysticism its origin, essentially. He sees a vision, Ezekiel in Babylon, and it's this weird vision that he has, and he writes about it very succinctly, although, it's incomprehensible what he's talking about. But one thing that struck me as very interesting, and it's something that struck me about the tales of Lovecraft as well, which I've mentioned in other places. Lovecraft, when he writes his short stories, he's very specific about the date, month, and year that something happens. I mean, he's always putting the dates in there, which is kind of unusual for this type of genre. In Ezekiel, probably alone, not alone, there are a few other instances, but Ezekiel actually opens his book by telling you exactly the day, month, and year in which he's having this vision and the direction that he's looking. And I thought, well, that's kind of extreme. We can actually go back and look at that date, month, and year. It's very specific. Biblical scholars know exactly when it is. And then just plot where he was standing in Babylon, and he was looking due north, because he says out of the north came this vision. And that's when it all started to fall together to me, that he was staring at what is basically the Big Dipper. And the Big Dipper is always in the north. I mean, the North Star is always there. That's why it's called the North Star. And the idea of celestial ascent as being an ascent up the 7 visible stars of the Dipper to the North Star seemed to me to be the key to the whole thing. I mean, it just opened up an entire world of understanding about celestial ascent, which then prompted me to go and look at the Chinese version of the Pace of You, called Yubong, for instance, which is, the Chinese mystics actually walking in a pattern imitating the 7 stars of the Dipper. Because they are ascending up those stars, they're attaining immortality. It's part of the immortality process. Shamanism, the shamans climbing a tree to the North Star, and then coming back down from the North Star again. The pyramid texts of Egypt, all of this started to tie in together. And to me, it was very exciting because I thought this is it. The ancients were not that stupid. They weren't talking about the 7 planets all the time. They knew the sun and moon were different from the other 5 planets. When they keep referring to the 7, in my way of thinking, and this is my belief based on this study, they're talking about the Big Dipper, and the reason they're talking about it is because it's circumpolar. It never sets below the horizon. It's always there. It is the perfect symbol for immortality. The entire world, from their perspective, revolves around that central star, and those 7 other stars of the Dipper lead straight to it.
I would like to add also that if any of you is interested in those dates that Peter just mentioned, go and read his Lovecraft Code trilogy, which is full of dates, and he really he maps a very interesting calendar of dates that appear in Lovecraft stories and things that happened in the real world, in our world, right,
Yeah.
at the same time. I mean, I'm not gonna say more. Like, you should read the book and map the calendar. There's definitely something about this, this living clues and hints in dates, and they're always almost invariably connected with something that's happening in the sky, okay, in the stars. Another thing to say, Peter mentioned the importance of the Big Dipper, right? um, well, that's also something that's very important in, I would say, in Thelema, and especially in the dilemma of Kenneth Grant. So that disciple of Aleister Crowley that focused his magical philosophy, especially in the contact with the other. Well, the Big Dipper, the Polaris, and the Great Bear in the sky is for Grant a representation of the Great Dragon, and the idea that these stellar cults comes from the stars and came down to earth through this stairway to heaven, but in this case it's descending to us, and planted the seed of initiation in our cultures in the times before time. I would say, in Masonry we would say in time immemorial. Okay, and once again, where are we going with all of this? Right? So what we're trying to, well, prove, I think Peter proved it in his book already, and everybody who's involved with magic knows it because that's how things work.
Mm-hmm.
What we would like to more people to know is that a lot of the discourse right now is focused on the idea of disclosure, right? And disclosure for me, as more or less an external observer, because I'm interested in all of this, but I'm not really
You're
part.
opening a can of worms here, Marco.
I know. That's what I
Hey,
do
do it,
usually.
buddy. Do it, buddy, because that's what we're here to do. Love it.
And but the problem is that everybody's waiting for disclosure, but we already had it thousands of years ago, right? It's already been here all the time, and if anybody's really interested in this, right? If anybody's really want to have the proof that this non-human intelligence exists, and the proof of their interaction with humanity throughout the history of humanity, you have to pick up magical practice and do it seriously, because it's always been there. It's encoded
Right.
in our cultures, right? So yeah.
It
um,
really is, and I'm so glad that you've touched on that. I debate sometimes with a very good friend of mine, someone very close to me. They're very much into the whole disclosure thing. Where me, as someone who was brought up around themes and narratives that you guys are discussing, disclosure is never, it's not the important thing to me because of my belief system and what I've been exposed to as a child living the life that we led, that I was very much on your bus, if that makes sense. So it'd be interesting to see what some of our listeners have to say on that, which takes me to another question that was sort of flying through my mind as you were talking. How, and this is a question to you both, how do you both sort of view the current shift, certainly in the UAP, UFO community, towards more alternative theories beyond this nuts and bolts approach? I'm certainly seeing it as someone who is probably described as a little bit woo, and I come from the other side of the fence. 2 years ago, if someone had asked me any nuts and bolts question, I would have been like, who? Because I occupied a different space. But from your perspective, how are you viewing that shift from the sort of nuts and bolts into a more alternative view? And I'll send that one over to Peter first.
Very well, thank you. I've been agitating for this for a long time. I agitated for it in Secret Machines and in all the presentations I've given, since I got involved with Tom about whenever it was, 2014 until now. And that is God, it's been 10 years. Oh God, I'm older than I thought. Anyway, so
Tell me, I feel it. I feel it.
Oh my God, 10 years. It seems like 3 or 4 years now. It's been 10. Anyway, my point is that the government doing the UFO research, that's fine. They do what they have to do. And, the scientific community doesn't really get involved except a few outliers here and there. And private industry, of course, is probably more involved than we realize in this type of research. But what we're missing is all the rest of humanity becoming involved in this. We need the soft sciences, we need the arts, we need the humanities, we need everybody on deck to understand this. And the woo aspect of it, the occult aspect of it, shouldn't really dominate from my perspective. It is a way in specifically for people who are willing to devote the time and energy required, right? So if you have the time and energy required and you really want to get involved in it, you want to know what this is on your own, you can do it. The body itself is a vehicle for doing this. And if I've learned nothing else from all the years that I've been studying these disciplines, Western, Eastern, African, Afro-Caribbean, and all the rest of it, is that the body itself is the chariot, is the vehicle. If you can just learn how to use it, to understand the relationship between consciousness and the body, and the magical practices that Marco's talking about, you can begin to understand the rest of this whole subject. As I've said many times, if all you do is you read books about UFOs, you'll never understand UFOs, because UFO books are written always from one perspective. It's either a nuts and bolts thing. How many sightings were there? Can we depend upon the eyewitnesses? Why is the government hiding it up? It's the same old story. It goes on forever, right? But if we take the arts, the sciences, if we take the experiences of people who have undergone, for instance, colonization, we need to talk to people who've been colonized. We need to understand the experience of people who've lost their homes, because this may be something that we have to face in the future. If these aliens are, beings of some kind, if they have designs on the planet, right? It would be kind of helpful to know how other cultures have dealt with that reality. In the United States, we really don't have much of that experience as far as, people of white European descent. But if we talk about people in Latin America and Africa and Asia who've been colonized by superior technology, there is a consciousness shift that takes place. Your culture undergoes a shift. You begin to adapt to the new reality of these new weapons and the new materialisms, and at the same time trying to safeguard your own spiritual self, your own consciousness in the face of it. This is something that we need to study. We need to know it. I mentioned before, for instance, in some other cases, the Dalai Lama at one point invited a bunch of rabbis to come to Dharamsala, where he's located, to understand how they were able to keep their religion and their faith and their practices, their language, after 2,000 years of diaspora. because the Dalai Lama was facing the same eventuality. He had lost his country, and the Tibetans were now being scattered around the world. So he wanted to learn from them. And I think that's a kind of a telling situation. I think we need to learn in general how that happens. We need to learn from the shamans. We need to learn from the mystics and from the painters, the musicians, the writers. And we need to learn from people in very basic industries. And an example that I use is somebody involved in garbage disposal, right? If somebody like that were to be abducted and taken aboard a spacecraft, what would they notice? They would notice something that you won't find in the literature anywhere, but they will notice that there is no garbage disposal aboard a UFO. There's no wastebasket, right? There is no system for recirculating bad air or anything like that. I mean, it would jump out. Things that we would not think of if we have a different job would jump out to somebody who has a different job. So we need everybody to look at the data, everybody to look at the experiences, everybody to look at the eyewitness accounts, as well as people like Dr. Gary Nolan, who's doing the genetic work and trying to figure out, what kind of impact it has to be a contactee. What impact does it have on your DNA, as an example? Or some of the physicists and some of the biologists, people trying to understand the biological implications of contact. This is all what we need, but we need everything else as well. We need an artistic approach to this, which is why I talk about a consciousness approach, not just the nuts and bolts. The nuts and bolts are important, but the consciousness aspect is also very, very important, because every time a person sees a UFO, their consciousness shifts in order to accommodate that new reality, because that reality doesn't exist anyplace else. They weren't brought up with it. It's not part of their culture. They're just seeing a freaking thing in the sky, right, with lights on it, and it just makes no sound and hovers over and then disappears. Well, how do you accommodate that? What do you do with that? Where do you put it? And I think that's what we need to learn and to find out, because if it happens more and more regularly, and it will, because we all have cell phones, we all have access to immediate communications. We have video cameras on our phones. All of this is there to record these things as they happen. We're going to need answers pretty soon. And that's what I think our government is worried about. All the governments are worried about around the world. They know that we have the access to this technology, and pretty soon we're going to start asking very hard questions.
And
That gave me
like riffing on what Peter just said, I in theory I should be very much pro this, woo and magic approach to the phenomenon. I mean, I say that, right? In many ways, it's our birthright. What I'm noticing, however, is that those who are speaking in favor of you know adopting a magical lens to explain the phenomenon are switching very hardly and very fast towards changing that magical lens into a religious lens. And I think Peter, Peter mentioned this in his book, like the fact that UFOs are cargo cults in many ways, right? And it seems to me that, and I'm kind of scared about that in many ways, that instead of going the direction that Peter just mentioned, like having a scientific approach, but almost like using the scientific method across all the abilities that we can deploy into this research. Instead, there's a faction, there's a fringe group. Some of them are very well known and very vocal, that they're trying to push the agenda or the idea that, well, you know what, this is a religion, right? Like, these are our new gods, like we have to make sense or famously, again, not gonna name names, but let's say
Oh,
there's
Marco, you're so sassy tonight. I like it.
well, that's what I do usually. I mean,
I
let's
know.
say people that want to say that these are angels or demons, with the implication, right, that there must be, I mean, we must be on the sides of the angels and against the against the side of the demons. I'm definitely convinced, and it was Peter that actually convinced me of this through several chats we had, that there is an inherent danger to just expose yourself to the other, pretending that it's just it's something that's just good for everybody. Like, as Peter said, like every time you see something in the sky, you will be changed by it. And the more and more people report this, the more our society as a whole change. It's almost like it's almost like a code is being downloaded into our society, and if we don't know what it's doing, well, it's almost like it's gonna start, recode ourselves, right? The way we as humans perceive the universe, and maybe that's not good. Right? Maybe that's not what we want. We want to have a little bit more of control, especially if we have the technology to do so. Well, the polar opposite of having control is to just start seeing these experiences as a new religion, and just blindly believe once again in angels and demons. I mean, maybe they are angels and demons. Certainly, in my in my neck of the woods, right, in a magical community, we do have regular contacts with what you would call angels or demons and everything in between. But I think we should try and be a little bit more detached at first. And I mean, that's why I like the general term non-human intelligences, because they are intelligences. Oftentimes they are conscious aggregates of consciousness, not tied to a specific physical body, but they're still our intelligence themselves. So yeah.
That was a great answer, and it's really interesting when in my work, and I know Peter, we're very new to each other. Marco knows a little bit about what I do. I came into this community very much around the whole human initiated contact stuff. I've had experiences since childhood, but my initial experiences I thought were a result of my mother's magical practice. I didn't connect what I'd seen with the others or UFOs or aliens. So it's really interesting to me how we see these emerging sort of contact cults and these groups of people that sometimes dominate the conversation, and it can go a little bit awry. And sometimes for me personally, I'm contacted on a daily basis of people having experiences, and we're just in a very interesting time because, as you so rightly said, Peter, that we all have mobile phones, we can all connect quicker. We're in a space right now connecting all over the world, talking about this subject. So just dialing back to both of you, touch on consciousness and maybe thinking about the course that you guys are about to, move forward with. What sort of role does consciousness play in understanding UAP experiences? And how is that weaved in perhaps to your course, Marco, Peter?
Peter, you go first.
It's like this. The experiences that people have of UFOs that have been recorded, especially the last 70 years, but throughout history. I mean, Jacques Vallée put out a book some years ago in which he traced, UFO sightings going back to the time of ancient Egypt, right? So we're talking about UFO sightings on forever, but they've always been unannounced. They show up, they say hi, they do something weird, and then they leave, right? So we have no control over this, which is what freaks out the military and freaks out our intelligence services and those of other countries around the world. These things just show up when they want to. They play games, they say hi, they make patterns, they flash lights, and they disappear. There is another whole approach to this, which is that let us ourselves try to control that experience or try to become better experiencers of that experience, become more proactive, essentially. When these things are happening, we normally have no control over it. The whole point of religion and magic since the beginning, I think, we talked about this in Secret Machines, Gods, and Marco rightly said, like a cargo cult. We've had this experience as humans, as a human race. We were wandering around for millions of years on this planet, and then about maybe 100,000, maybe 200,000 years ago, suddenly something happened, and civilization got jump-started. People started building cities. They started doing farming work, agriculture, fishing, all these things. Suddenly, we became a civilization. And the idea is that something started that, something initiated that. And our position we're taking is we're speculating, but we're saying that was the original point of contact between us and them, whatever they are. That started it. And then throughout history, there have been times when they've showed up again, and they've showed up again, and they've showed up again. Well, we've had entire priesthoods built predicated on the assumption that we can somehow communicate to them from our side, not just waiting for them to show up, but actually going to where they are, somehow traveling to their space. And that's what the course is about. The course is talking about it firstly from an academic point of view. I have to say this was, as I say, my graduate thesis, and it started on discussing ancient Egypt, ancient Babylon, and their ascent ideas, the Egyptians and the pharaohs and the opening of the mouth ceremony and all the rest of it. We will discuss that. We will discuss the Sumerian New Year's rituals, which are very similar, walking up the ziggurat to communicate with the gods at the top. All of these things, and all over the world. Now, anthropologists and historians of religion hate it when you start talking about anything that you say everybody does. You're not supposed to talk about universalism. It's a dirty word. It's, Fraser's Golden Bough era, and they hate that because it sounds like a kind of a colonialist mentality, an imperialist mentality, that we're putting everything in a box and saying these people are less advanced, these people are more advanced. That's not it at all. What we're saying is that human beings in general around the world have had similar experiences. They may express them a little differently, but at heart, some symbols stand out. And the number 7 is one that stands out constantly. And why wouldn't it if you look up in the sky and you see the same 7 stars every night, but pointing in a different direction every night? And you realize at a certain point, those stars are a clock, they're a calendar, they're a compass. They actually bifurcate, they separate time and space and then bring them all together in one unit. It must have made a tremendous impression on people around the world. And they somehow linked it with these practices of immortality and with traveling to space. Space travel and immortality are the 2 things that we inherited from our ancient forebears back before Sumer, before Babylon. We've inherited this concept that we want to be immortal and we want to leave the planet, or at least we want the option to be able to leave the planet. So I think that by studying the celestial ascent practices, which have existed and survived until the present day in occult practices all around the world, and spiritual practices all around the world, even ones that we see every day and we don't realize what we're looking at. If we can go back to that and look at it, we can just dissect it and maybe figure out a plan for ourselves for disclosure, personal, human, individual disclosure. Or if not disclosure, I like to call it confirmation, because we already kind of know what's going on. What we need is our personal confirmation to see it with our own eyes and to say, okay, yes, this is happening and this is why.
And like, as we kind of made the point so far, to master these techniques would take maybe not a lifetime, but several decades. Okay, and so we're not gonna give anybody the impression that by signing up on a course online, hearing Peter and me speaking on Zoom once a week, we can really teach you all the secrets of all the various practices of spiritual ascent and celestial ascent. However, what we can do is not only give you the historical background. I mean, that's again, Peter's book is the foundation of those lessons, but also over the years I found out that a good way to give people a glimpse of what these practices are about is through what we call path working. Okay, path working. If
You are literally hearing the questions in my head before they're coming out my mouth. This is fantastic. We should
well, it's Matt.
collaborate more. My
Happy to do so.
question was, sorry to interject, was to sort of explain this and how that would work within the course. So crack on, my friend. If you could explain that side of things, marvelous. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. So yeah, I mean, like, so what we can do is that every week we can present a path working. A path working really is a sort of guided meditation, and there's a little bit more to that because it's not just you sitting down maybe with noise cancellation headphones, maybe relaxing sounds. Uh, there's the sounds themselves will be interesting because I will be using hemisync, and if everybody has been I know you've been to the Moral Institute, so you know exactly what hemisync is. But the idea of using specific frequencies to induce like states of trance, and through that deeper how you say relaxation, you can then start presenting images that connect through a series of paths that are not immediately obvious to the conscious mind, but they are there. It's almost like we have these paths imprinted into us, right? I mean, Jung spoke of archetypes. I don't know if I really want to call them archetypes, but if anybody is familiar with Jung's psychology, you can get a similar vibe of what these path workings actually do and how they work. Well, what we can do, in fact, every week we can present a path working where people can sit down in their own time, take maybe 1 hour of their day, and experience, for instance, what the vibe of the pace of you would be, what the vibe of the opening of the mouth ceremony would be, and maybe these glimpses of much more complex rituals that would require, in many ways, maybe actually proper initiation, right? This might actually give everybody, take experiencing this path working, the the fuel to go explore more, right? And as Peter was saying, maybe to start their own confirmation instead of disclosure program. That's what we're aiming to do, right? We'll see. We'll see if we're going to be successful in a couple of months.
I really enjoy that phrase confirmation. And I think it's something I'm certainly going to weave into my world because it actually kind of makes a lot of logical sense. So, just touching on the course, I am going to open up this space for questions. I'm being direct messaged at light speed right now. So, we will take some questions after, just request to speak, and if we can bring you up, we will. But in terms, so the course starts on the 2nd of September, not September, February.
It's the 2nd of February. Next week, literally from a week from now, me and Peter will be on a Zoom with, well, so far almost like 30 people. Hopefully, some more will join us. But especially, I should say, this is a one-off, right? It's this time or never. Especially because Peter is very very busy. I'm not as busy as him, but I'm writing my second book as well. So I will be disappearing from social media for a while after this, thankfully, because social media tend to be a bit of like an abyss from time to time. Not today. Today's fantastic. But yeah, maybe it's more to say that this is going to be like a one-off. Like we're going to do this time, and then that's us then.
Perfect. So it starts on the 2nd of February. It's a weekly course. How many weeks does it go over?
Well, 7, of course.
7, duh. 7 weeks. Okay, brilliant. And will people need anything by themselves? Or will they just need to turn up? Is there anything extra people need to do? Do they need to have read the book? Or can they, what can they expect? What do they need to bring?
Nothing, themselves and the willingness to experience and to learn, really. The book, if you read the book, that's fantastic. I am in the process of re-editing the book in order for those who haven't read it, they'll be able to have important passages that we will then discuss in our weekly sessions, where pretty much it will be similar to what we're doing now, right? It will be maybe a little bit of a small lesson, right, to explain directly the whatever we've been reading the previous week, and then I will introduce the path working for the week. So it's very simple. You don't need anything else, just the willingness to, I don't know, maybe encounter the other.
I love it. So we have some questions and some hands up.
Hey, what's up, Holly? Thanks for having me on. It's great space. Amazing discussion. I have a question for Peter. Last year, I believe you tweeted something very interesting, which was to the effect of if millions of people woke up the next day and had the same dream of contacting aliens, that would be more towards disclosure, something to that effect. And I wonder if maybe you can expand on that thought a little bit, but also how you see the non-human intelligence motivated to make itself known. So people that aren't trying to make contact, and some people talk about spontaneous experiences with UFOs, but do you feel as though there's a motivation from the other side to sort of make itself known, and it's getting more and more pressure to do so?
I think it's a good question. Thank you. I think that the the circumstances on this planet make it such, like I mentioned, the capability we each of us have with our phones, if nothing else, to capture what's going on around us. I think all of this is contributing to this idea that the whatever they are is much more present than they used to be, or so we may jump to conclusions and say, well, it's just because we have better technology. I think there's more to it than that. I think what we've learned about the Nimitz episodes, about the Tic Tacs, about the ships on both coasts, and what they go through when they are being, pestered by these things in the sky, something that I call the government of the sky. I think that this is an indication that we are closer to having some kind of more direct confirmation of this experience than we've ever had before. In the first place, we're up there. And this is the first time in human history we've been up there. We were not up there, not even in the late 19th century. We had balloons, but that was about as far as it went. Now we've actually sent, a spacecraft into the far reaches of our own solar system. So we're up there. We're in that realm that we always associated with them, with that other, with those secret machines, and with the whatever they are, the gods, the aliens, the demons, whatever you want to call them. So I think that what's happening now is we are, number one, we're getting much more confirmation than we ever used to from people who are really literally on the front lines of this. But even more, we're beginning to understand there is a huge consciousness factor at work here. And the reason I say that is because the famous Nimitz episode is the thing that people did not pay enough attention to at the time. And that is that the craft would show up, and then the pilots on the Hornets would report this back to the ship. And all that's perfectly fine. They're seeing the stuff, they're freaking out and all the rest of it. Then they all disappear, the craft. And the aircraft, the Hornets, our naval aircraft, are supposed to then the word just went out of my head. They're supposed to meet up again at another place in the sky, right? At this other place called a CAP. I think it's an access point. And so what they're supposed to do, a computer generates this on board the ship. They generate coordinates, longitude, latitude, all the rest of it, and they say, okay, you're supposed to, all meet up at this point. So the aircraft now are moving towards that direction. They've gotten the information on their onboard computers. They're flying towards that area, and the ship radios to them and says, so you're not going to believe this, but they're waiting for you. Now, that blew my mind. That blew my mind more than anything else that happened concerning the Nimitz and the Tic Tacs and all the other stuff that was going on, was the fact that this craft, this foreign craft, this non-human intelligence piloted craft, knew where our CAP was going to be before we did. I mean, the violation of not just, our secure communications, which are the most secure communications in the world if they're aboard our, our ships at sea, it's not just that was violated. They knew ahead of time. It's as if they knew what the computer would spit out before the computer was able to do so. And I think that's where we're touching on the consciousness aspect of this. We have to take that into consideration. Something very strange happened there that should not have happened under any circumstances, but did. And it's not like some one plane made a lucky guess. The entire squadron of whatever it was they were chasing shows up at the rendezvous point. And they're waiting for the American naval pilots to show up. That's freaky. I'm sorry, but that's really freaky. But that really comes down to some of the testing that we've been doing in this country at SRI, places like that, where we've been, doing remote viewing work. We've been doing ESP type of work. We've been doing telekinesis things, all of this stuff, because we know that there is a connection there. We know there is a consciousness connection. And perhaps we need that consciousness connection, maybe even to pilot a craft of that nature. Maybe that's the interface. And that's why I say we need all hands on deck.
Wow. That was, I keep getting goosebumps. So, wow. Who was next, John? Was it estimate or B?
I think it's B, and then I think after that we're going to go with experience. Oh, sorry, no, estimates first, then B, then experience.
Hey, B, you got a question for Marco and Peter?
I do, but I'd like to follow the line that that John figured out, if that's okay.
Sorry, your audio was quite low. I couldn't hear you.
I
We'll
think she
move.
said throw it to Estimate.
Okay, Estimate, you're up, bud. You got a question?
Hey, Peter. I got to meet you at Inquiry, I believe, last year, and I really love the story that, like, how you got inspired by a comic book. I got to give you one, which was pretty cool.
That's right.
But you gave one of like the best lectures I thought that day, and since then, like, I've been, I've definitely been quote unquote a fan. But I am basically here to ask a question for a friend who is at work, but he's on the panel right now, and I would love to. I would ask the panel to maybe give him a shot because I know he has to go soon. And this guy has really introduced me to a lot of your work, including Secret Machines and things like that. And I know like it would mean the world for him to be able to ask these two very in-depth questions. And it's galactic down there.
Galactic, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you so much. Can you all hear me okay?
Yep.
Awesome.
Yep.
I just wanted to, well, first say thank you for being here and doing this. But secondly, I had a quick question about the hieroglyphs and the symbols that commonly pop up in craft all over the time when they crash, or supposedly it's reported. So I was curious about what your opinions are on the functionality behind those symbols, because through my like own studying, they sort of look like alchemical symbols and magical sigils most of the time that they show up. So I'm curious, like from the perspective of like a non-human intelligence piloting the craft, what exactly would the purpose and functionality be of these symbols as they relate to the mind of the pilots and the functionality of the craft itself? And I was also curious because about other than the functionality, what would you say? Would you say there's any connection between those symbols and I guess what is referred to as Symbola and Synthamata in the Chaldean oracles, which are actually, since this has all to do with celestial ascent, they're actually described in there as the means by which the soul or the world is created, and by which the soul is led back up to its divine origin. So I was curious if there's a possible connection there as well. But thank you.
Wow. How much time do we have?
Yeah, that's a good one, right?
That's a good.
We have as much time as you and Marco have to spend with us. This is totally over to you guys. I have a feeling we could be here till dawn, but whatever you guys can spare, we will be grateful of. So that was some question. Wow. So I look forward to it. Was fabulous.
Let me jump in just on that first part of the question, at least. The idea of the symbols, what they represent. If one of our aircraft, and they have occasionally, crashed into some foreign country, the people there, let's say it was a cargo cult situation, and they're crashing into some relatively undeveloped technologically part of the world, and they would see symbols on the side of our craft. They would see maybe an American flag and not know what the hell that was, except maybe they might understand the stars and think that's where we came from. They might see the American eagle and think it's an alchemical symbol. There's all kinds of ways where we might misunderstand or misinterpret these symbols. They could just be simply saying, you know, made on Mars, right? We don't know because we don't have an idea. And the I hate to, you know, to be so so pragmatic about this, but also the idea of the alchemical symbols and the other symbols, they may be similar in a sense. They could be something that made perfect sense at one time. When these symbols were created, they meant something very specific. But as we know, as Marco knows too, when you're looking at the grimoires, when you're looking at the workbooks of the magicians, these symbols degrade over time as they're copied from one person to another, from one text to another, to the point where we don't know what they were supposed to mean originally. And then we're really happy if we find a very old original copy and we say, oh, that's what the problem was. Some scribe miscopied it. So there's the idea that symbols can degrade over time. They can mean different things in different cultures. So we take all of that into consideration as scientific thinking people, right? As rational, pragmatic people. But at the same time, realize that writing has a magical power. The ancient Egyptians assigned Thoth, the god of writing, to also being the god of magic. Magic and writing, magic and hieroglyphs, magic and that kind of symbolic communication was already considered magical, even in the most ancient times. So it's entirely possible, to go back to your question, that these symbols do have meaning far in advance of what we might assign to them, more than just sounds and words in a foreign language. They may mean something, or even more than that. The position of those symbols on the craft may themselves be integral to the functioning of the craft. This is why we need, again, as I harp on it, all hands on deck. We need people who are linguists. We need people who have a background in archaeology and anthropology to bring new and fresh ideas to understanding this. Because I have the funny feeling we have the information that we need in our possession. We're just not using it because we don't have the right people looking at it. Marco, the chair is yours.
Wow. Yep, back that one over to Marco.
Another thing that, if I can just interject on that, right? There's another thing that Peter mentioned, the idea that in grimoires, the symbols degrade. Always, you all should remember that Tritemius, which is considered to be, and it's not just a philosopher, it's considered to be also like one of the forefather of modern magic. He was a cryptographer first and foremost, and a lot of the symbols that you find in Tritemius' books on magic, like the steganographia, okay, they were in fact symbols that basically there were codes, right? So the idea is that yes, there is definitely the a link between hieroglyphics and words of power. Remember, hieroglyphics really means, right, holy writ, right? But also remember that a lot of what we consider alchemical symbols or magical symbols are degraded symbols that in fact at first had almost no magical value at all. They were cryptographics pretty much. So it could well be the same thing, right? As Peter said, we don't know really up until we finally have some sort of I don't know, dictionary. We will never know.
Also, one thing to remember is that if you look at the three books of Cornelius Agrippa, for instance, one of the fathers of modern ceremonial magic, you will see planetary squares. And these planetary squares, these are magic squares that have numbers and cells, and they add up to the same number, whether it's, columns or rows or diagonals. And they would use these squares as the matrix on which to draw the seals of planets. So a planetary intelligence, they would have this weird looking symbol, and nobody knew what that meant until it was discovered that these were actually simply traced from square to square to spell out the name in Hebrew on these particular squares. So we were looking at symbols that we thought were really spooky, and we didn't know how they arrived at those symbols. But then in the Golden Dawn, it's very clear in the text of the Golden Dawn, this is what it was. Here's this magic square for Mars, and here's Bartzable, and this is how we draw it on the magical square. We connect all the letters, B-A-R-T-Z, etc. And nobody knew this, right? I mean, if you were a kid like me trying to study all of this back in the 60s, you're looking at this and saying, what is, how did they arrive at this? Did the spirit actually write his name? And of course, no, it was, a very intelligently done coding system, as Marco said. So the occultists know a lot about this. Just send some of them to work on these projects. You might be surprised.
Wow. What a great space. I'm just so grateful you guys were able to join in this. For once, Holly's lost for words. This doesn't happen very often. I'm going to bob it over to, that was very British. I'm going to bob it over to B, because I don't think we heard you very well. Have you got a question, my love?
Amazing. Can you hear me better now?
We can.
Awesome. Thank you, as always, for these amazing spaces, everybody. Thank you for being here. I'm really excited about the course that you guys have coming up, and I plan on attending. However, my question resides with Peter over a statement that he made at last year's inquiry into the anomalous that has really festered within me as a fellow practitioner and researcher of Heisen CE5. Peter, you said that Falun Gong had been designated a UFO cult, and I'd really like to have more information on that, any that you could give, because as somebody that researches these heist movements and CE5 movements, a lot of their practices seem to be in alignment with those, so it's concerning.
No problems. Yes, I'll be discussing this more at length in a different context. I have worked on this for a while. I think it's going to show up in, don't ask me when, but it will show up in Secret Machines Book 3 in a bit more detail. But the founder of Falun Gong in China was a man called Li Hongzhi. And Li Hongzhi started as a Qigong practitioner. Now, if you know Chinese culture, Chinese medicine, Qigong is an internal medicine practice. It's similar to yoga, you might say, because it involves breath, but it involves more body movement than holding a particular position for any length of time. And it's a way of moving, massaging the organs, you might say, using your breath, right? Using breath and using concentration. Well, he started that way, and Qigong is very famous in China. It's very well known. It's an ancient technique, part of Chinese medicine. But then he kind of moved away from that, and he created Falun Gong, which means the work of the Dharma wheel in Chinese. And so it kind of looks Buddhist, maybe, kind of looks something from the subcontinent. But then he was interviewed in Time magazine, and that was in 1999. And there was a crackdown on Falun Gong shortly after this interview was released in Time. And that's when the Chinese government got really upset with Falun Gong. And he said in that interview, he says, I'll quote him, I have it in front of me as a matter of fact, just as it happens. He said, since the beginning of this century, aliens have begun to invade the human mind and its ideology and culture. The aliens come from other planets. Some are from dimensions that human beings have not discovered. They've introduced modern machinery like computers and airplanes, and the ultimate purpose is to replace humans. This is the founder of Falun Gong saying that the aliens are here, they've taught us technology, and they're trying to replace us. Well, that basically put him right into the UFO cult category. And so the Chinese government started to crack down not just on Falun Gong, but they started to take a very close look at UFO groups in China, which there were many, and there are still quite a few. And they started making the requirements for joining a UFO organization in China very stringent. You had to have a college degree, you had to have published in the field and everything else. So suddenly they sort of cleared out a lot of what was happening in ufology in China and made it basically a government sanctioned enterprise, with a lot of restrictions. But Falun Gong was definitely was stopped because number one, he was teaching these people to be self-sufficient, to have direct contact with the divine, not to bother about the government, basically. And also, a lot of these practices were being adopted by people in the government, in the Chinese military, in the Politburo. So it was getting to be unwieldy because in China, of course, religion is the opiate of the people, right? So they've made some concessions to religion, but only insofar as they can control it. That goes to Tibetan Buddhism, for instance. They've had the Panchen Lama in their custody since the Panchen Lama was identified. They've replaced him with somebody else. They plan on doing the same thing with the Dalai Lama. So all of this, they want to control this type of experience. And now with the UFO thing on top of it, which is considered a national security issue, as it is in this country, the last thing they needed was a bunch of people running around and claiming they were in contact with space aliens. So yeah, that is what happened with Falun Gong. That is how it started. He was very upfront about it in that interview. He said it was never his intention to create a system whereby people would just simply get rid of illnesses, get rid of disease, and get better. He wanted them to break through to in consciousness and, I guess, make contact with alien intelligences or whatever. The whole thing got very strange, very fast, like Scientology with Xenu and all of that stuff, and with the Mormons with inheriting a planet if you're a good Mormon when you die, all this kind of stuff. There is this tendency with modern religions to have a UFO component, and it's my contention that that was always a component of religion and occultism, which is a part of an active part of religion. So I think this has always been there. It's always been the case. It's always been part of it. It's just that now we're seeing these lines being drawn more clearly.
Wow. I think we had Dove, Darcy, and then Paul. Marco, Peter, are you guys good for time?
I am.
I am as well. Yep.
Yeah. Okay,
I think I was next, Holly, just to jump in. Hopefully I can
Oh,
get
I'm
in before
sorry.
her.
I didn't.
Nah, but
Sorry,
good.
Experience. You were next, actually. Fire, crack on.
So excellent space. This is right up my alley. I just wanted to comment something on real quick. So the idea of disclosure and reaching a point of confirmation, like you said, is important to me because I always felt like once we get past that point of nuts and bolts and all that stuff, that we actually have to reach back to the past and the ancient and the esoteric and kind of maybe wipe the whiteboard and kind of refine and refocus what history on this planet looked like. So to me, I kind of lean towards the Sumerian creation myth on this planet because it's the most ancient. So my question is, the story of Enki and Enlil and Anu, how does that incorporate or correlate to some of the other gods that were present around that time? We're talking about Greek mythology, the Hindu gods, Egyptian gods. Is there a one-in-one correlation like Thoth and Hermes were said to be the same being back then? And my thing is just specificity now. Let's get specific. These things, these beings had names. You know what I mean? So if we can get more specific and kind of refine that focus in history, I think would be very intriguing to me, like moving forward. Well, I think the problem is culture. We're seeing the same thing. We're having the same experience, but we're translating it through our own culture, right? So the cultural differences are very important to try to understand what is really being discussed and what they're really talking about in these ancient texts. And we are translating from the benefit of thousands of years of history after them. We're trying to recreate what that mind was like back in the time of ancient Sumer. So we can translate to a certain extent. We think we understand what a lot of the writing is. We've translated prayers and rituals, but that doesn't mean we understand what they are. That doesn't mean we understand as Marco would say, the vibe, right? Like if you're doing the path work and you're getting the vibe right away. We're not recreating those rituals. We don't have enough information maybe to really recreate them perfectly. So we're a little bit still at sea with trying to be as specific as you would like, as specific as an anthropologist or an archaeologist would like, or a comparative, somebody who specializes in religious studies would like. We're always bumping up our heads against this wall. What did this word really mean? And when somebody in a tropical country talks about a god of fire, is it the same as a person growing up in a Nordic country, for instance? Does fire have the same meaning, the same relevance psychologically? And therefore, does the myth concerning, and I use myth as a very loose term, does the story, does the experience of that divinity, is it equal to that fire god in both places? So it's still tricky. It's still very difficult. We can find our way through. There are gods of wisdom. There are gods of fertility. There's gods of the storm. The first god of in ancient Palestine, Israel, and the Middle East was a storm god, and the storm god had a wife. And the god of the Israelites had a wife until they sort of wiped her out of the Bible. So that's the other problem we have. The myths are not always intact. So when we start looking, for instance, at the story of Asherah, which was the wife of Jehovah, let's call him Hashem, as the Jews would say, Hashem's wife in this case was Asherah. There was an actual goddess, right? And the goddess had a special place restricted, for her in the temple before the Solomon's temple was built. There were groves of trees that were sacred to Asherah. And eventually they kind of got rid of Asherah out of the Bible. You still find her here and there being mentioned in passing. And everybody who was like in on it knew what that meant. But you will not see a depiction of Asherah in a synagogue today, not deliberately, not really. If you have eyes to see, you might find Asherah in the synagogue. But there will not talk about Asherah. There is no Asherah. Maybe Shekinah, something like that, but not Asherah. So when you've doctored the rituals that much, when you've doctored the religion that much, you're still not dealing with a full deck, right? Which is why I think the class that Mark and I are talking about is kind of worthwhile from the perspective that what it does is it tunes your own consciousness to this. It makes you aware, and it starts making you look for these things that must be missing because you feel the presence of something that's not there, right? You feel that there's something missing. And I'm sorry I could not give a very sharp and clear answer to your question, which deserves one. But from my years of studying this stuff, every time I think I've got it right, every time I think I've got an Aleister Crowley's 777 and can look right across the lines and say, well, this God equals this color, this number, this incense, I realize that has to be tweaked a little bit.
And you know what? I would also add something. You ask for specificity, and I understand why we as humans have a need for that, because we need to make sense of things with our brain. In Kabbalah, we would say that which we're using ruach. Okay, so we're using our anima, we're using our brain. Let's call it like that. That's how we do. That's also very important part of the scientific method, right? Which we aim to use. However, when we deal with consciousness, and then when we deal with the gates to consciousness that are outside the spectrum of science proper, it's difficult to aim for absolute specificity, because we are trying to imagine that we have all these little boxes, right? You mentioned like the god, let's say Hermes thought, right? So Hermes and thought became where they're the same god, right? Because the experience of those cults seemed similar to different cultures. First of all, if you start really studying the history of religions, you will realize that um, thought became Hermanubis before becoming Hermes, before becoming Mercury, and there's similarities there because the culture and the cult was similar, but the essence of the deity wasn't exactly the same. We're trying to fit in human boxes of logic and rationality concepts that are beyond human logic and rationality. And maybe we will never be able to we will just never be able to do it. What we can do it, however, is that aim to have an embodied and ecstatic experience. That's going back to the vision of Ezekiel that we started speaking of at the beginning of the space. That's what we can aim for, and that I think every human being can have that embodied and ecstatic vision. But if you want to then bring all back that to rationality and have the specificity of saying, I don't know, aliens are really Anunnaki. Well, I I don't see that happening. Like, I think it would be great if we could actually map all these creatures and all these gods and all these spirits, but maybe the real approach to this is to understand that consciousness is beyond Ruach. In fact, again, in Kabbalah, in Hermetic Kabbalah, there's exactly the next step. We move from the perceiving the universe around us through Ruach into perceiving it through Neshama. And Neshama, it's not logic anymore, it's not rationality anymore, it's more something like divine intuition. And that's what we're aiming at as explorers of the esoteric.
Awesome. Thank you guys for the response. Sorry to jump in there, Holly. I got a work call, so I just wanted to get it in there.
Absolutely no problem, my friend. Jeff?
Thank you so much for letting me ask a question. Peter and Marco, I'm such a fan of the work, and I'm going to look into the class more. I have a question regarding the discussion surrounding disclosure. And the idea, I've heard Holly talk about it, and I briefly spoke with her about the concept that disclosure has already occurred and that it's kind of keeps occurring over and over. And that we in the United States here are looking to our government kind of with our hands out, asking them for a quote sanctioned disclosure. And I'm just wondering if when I reread, I'm actually going through a reread right now of God's Man in War. It's a dense book, so it's going to take me 2 times to kind of absorb it fully, coming from a secular viewpoint, essentially, and, life path. But in one part of it, it's a very short little quote. It's written paradoxically, if our human authorities did acknowledge the existence of another authority, that would automatically undercut their ability to make such an acknowledgement. And essentially, how that is like a catch-22. I was wondering if there's any comments about that, or maybe a little bit of a clarification. And is that regarding the fact that, like, we as a society, like the issue of like monotheism versus polytheism and science versus religion? And then if finally, to wrap up, if disclosure has already happened and essentially we need to, it's more of a confirmation than it is a blatant explanation. Do you think that it's important that us as a society, as we as human beings, go back, kind of like Experience had just said, go back to the origins and go on this journey of learning about all of these things from the past that we may not realize correlate so closely to the phenomenon? And one other final little quote in Secret Machines, A Fire Within, and I know, Peter, you did not write this, nor did you, Marco, but one little part of it says, regarding the crop circles, and they're trying to come to an understanding of what they mean and how there's like a warring forces, a tension. It says, I think you understand that talking will only accelerate whatever is coming. And we as a people, maybe as a planet, need to be ready. Does that speak to this journey that I was asking about, that like we need to kind of go through the learning process, and disclosure cannot be explained as factual, but it's more of like a process that we all need to go through? Thank you so much.
Wow. Okay. Another hour to respond adequately to that.
Several hours, I think.
Great
Sorry.
question. No, but that's great. It's so cool that you have people really paying attention and asking these kinds of questions. It's outstanding. I don't know. Do you want to go first, Marco, or do you want me to go first?
No, please go.
Okay, disclosure. Disclosure is this loaded word, right? I don't like it really, because I think, as the caller said, disclosure has been going on. It's been an ongoing process for a very long time. But what we mean by disclosure now, like in the community, what it means by disclosure is the government coming out and saying, yes, we have UFOs. Here's a UFO and here's a dead alien or something. And they're calling that disclosure. And at the same time, they're saying, we don't trust anything coming out of the governments. No matter what they're telling us, it's going to be a lie. Well, that's catch-22 right there. We don't trust the government, therefore we want them to disclose. When they do disclose, we don't trust them. Chris Mellon, famously said, when are they ever going to take yes for an answer? And that's really what's been going on. They're being told yes. I mean, the hearings in Congress are yes. There's a lot of yes going on here, but everybody's picking it apart and saying, no, it's not really. Come on, we want a better disclosure than that. So yeah, is it a problem for the government? Absolutely. It's a challenge to their sovereignty. If the government cannot protect you from a perceived or perceivable threat, especially one in the skies, and they've got no explanation for it, they're going to deny it's even there. I mean, they're going to shrug their shoulders and say, no, it's swamp gas. I mean, they're going to have to, because if they say there's stuff out there, we don't know what it is, and in fact, it scares the hell out of us, we lose our faith in the government, even though the government's telling us the truth, right? So it is catch-22. There's no way out of this morass. So what the government is trying to do is kind of tiptoe through this labyrinth, through a maze, and try to get to the end of this maze in a way that doesn't really upset the complete apple cart. And I don't mean just for themselves, not just for the Pentagon or for Congress or whatever, but for all of us, right? This country, particularly in the United States, we've got 350 million plus people and about 400 million plus perspectives on the UFO phenomenon. So any rock that we throw into that puddle is going to have, repercussions that go out and in all different directions, and we don't know what the reactions are going to be. They're afraid of a collapse of faith in the government, in systems. They're afraid of a lack of faith in religions and a faith in systems in general, a faith in the human community, a lack of that kind of faith, which is why I've been drumming this drum. We have got to talk to people who've been through this already. Around the world, we have to understand how this works. We have to develop a mechanism for dealing with this, right? I think that we're grown up enough to accept a lot of disclosure, quite frankly, but it has to be handled intelligently, obviously. You don't just throw this down in front of a bunch of people and run away. So yeah, it's a problem. But the communication aspect of it that she mentioned, that she brought up, is also very important. It's not just that we're all talking more. It's not just that we're all talking about this a great deal more. It's the very fact that we have a World Wide Web, that we have an internet system, and we don't know what's going in. And the old saw that I grew up with in the old computer days when computers were massive was garbage in, garbage out, right? If you're putting in a lot of weird stuff into the internet, you're going to get a lot of weird stuff out. Okay. If our space brothers, such as they are, the same people who are screwing with our computers on board ships in the Pacific Ocean and telling, jets where to go, if they have that kind of access to onboard ship computers, which are heavily secure, heavily guarded and shielded against outside interference, if they can screw around with that, what's to stop them from screwing around with the internet, right? So the amount of questioning, the amount of talking and discussion that we're doing, it's quite possible it's not going unnoticed. The problem for us is we don't know what notice means to the others. Let's call them the others. We don't know if they understand things the same way we do. We don't even know if that's a concept, right? The abductees, when they've talked about communication or the close encounters people, they talk about communication with the others in terms of pictures in their head. It's basically a telepathic communication. It's not necessarily in words. So it may be that the proliferation of images on the internet is telling a better story than all the texts that we upload constantly. So it's possible there's a whole different way of looking at their way of looking at our world we may consider to be frightfully wrong, but we've got nothing to do. We can't fix that problem because we don't know how they're interpreting us. And it's the same thing as that earlier questioner mentioned about the hieroglyphs and everything else. We don't know this communication system. We don't understand it. We don't know how they communicate. We don't know if they breathe oxygen. We don't know if these are cyborgs, if they're robots, if they're, if they're Turing machines. We don't know if it's a von Neumann replication that we're talking about, things just repeating themselves and, saucers building themselves out of nothing. We don't know what's going on. So until we can...
I would argue, Peter, we don't even know if they perceive space and time the way we do, right?
Exactly. So where do we begin with this, right? So disclosure is very, very problematic, I understand, but they've got to start talking to us because they need the rest of us to get involved. I don't just mean me. What I mean is that the people who have backgrounds in the arts, as I said, in different ways of looking at reality, people who are in the soft sciences and the humanities, because the purely scientific and technical approach to this is not going to work. It hasn't worked so far as I can tell, and it's not going to work until we get everybody involved.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. Like, you just said everything, really.
I'll shut up now.
I guess I'll jump in. Yeah, thank you for such a intellectual and enriching conversation on all things related to the phenomenon. I've been sort of researching NASA, and they're partaking in what people used to call a cover-up. Nowadays, it's like truth embargo and all these other things. But there's a good history of NASA supposedly practicing occult rituals, especially back in the 1960s when they were doing the Apollo moon missions. So you had really high-level Freemasons like Buzz Aldrin. You had Nazis, ex-Nazis, and guys like Aleister Crowley, and you've already spoken about them, who formed JPL. I was wondering if you had ever looked into the sort of Richard C. Hoagland interpretation of rituals on the moon and sacred geometry and stuff that was practiced in space. Just curious about your thoughts on that. And do you think NASA still practices some of this stuff today behind closed doors, but they act stupid to the public about disclosure?
I think I can take this because, you mentioned JPL. And so, of course, JPL is Jack Parsons, and Jack Parsons is Aleister Crowley. And bit of disclosure, I am a high-ranking Freemason. And I can tell you that high-ranking Freemasonry has very little to do with anything we're discussing here. Freemasonry really is, for the most a group of men getting together for charity drives. That is the truth of it. I love the aesthetic of it. I get to do my Freemasonry here in London. I get to go into amazing buildings, so that's why I love it. And Freemasonry in many ways is the blueprint for ritual. Okay, so that's why I like it, right? So Buzz Aldrin being a Freemason, or maybe other people in NASA being Freemasons, I would tell you there's nothing there really. A lot of the ideas that most of who are not Freemasons have on Freemasonry comes from all series of books published in the 80s at the height of what was called the satanic ritual abuse or satanic panic. Well, 1.0, I would say, because we're really facing something similar happening right now. Now, what's interesting that you mentioned is JPL and so Jack Parsons. Like it is a fact, and this I can tell you, it is a fact that Jack Parsons was an occultist and a very dedicated one. Jack Parsons never met Aleister Crowley, and Aleister Crowley was never part of NASA or JPL. Um, but they never met. But Parsons was let's say Crowley's emissary in North America for a while. He was the master of Agape Lodge in Pasadena in the 40s. And Agape Lodge of OTO, or the Temple Orientis, was the only really operating lodge in the world. Another little bit of disclosure: when we hear online about Ordo Templi Orientis, people think of this, the cabal, the secret Illuminati running the world. I was a member of Ordo Templi Orientis. Is a dysfunctional group of old people trying to cosplay
Oh.
badly in Bob's basement, right? That's the truth of it. I mean, I'm sorry.
I know, I know, I know, I know.
Maybe I'm really like destroying the the expectations of many. Um, Jack Parsons was serious, though. He really did believe in magic, and he really did use magic in his experiment at Arroyo Seco when he was trying to, build the rockets, right? But that was him, right? He was a bit of a was a strange guy. He was seen as a strange guy, and in fact, his connections to his very open interest in magic was what led him to be fired from JPL, right? In fact, in times, people have thought that he might have been also like a spy from Israel. We don't know. If you're curious about Jack Parsons in particular, I definitely suggest you to read George Pendle's Strange Angel, of which they also did a very good show that only lasted for 2 seasons, unfortunately, before it was canceled. The very moment Hubbard shows up, the founder of Scientology, that would have been great to see how they would have portrayed Hubbard on screen, right? But anyway, so it is, what I'm trying to say here is that it's definitely true that there have been people in NASA, well, proto NASA, Jack Parsons, and there might be people in NASA later that are interested in magic. However, having quite a direct experience of how this group works and pretty much knowing a lot of the main players that are still alive in the world or in the cult world, I can tell you it's a cosplay group for the most, right? And that's kind of sad. It kind of destroyed the mystique of a lot of it, but that's the truth of it. So do I think that they were doing like strange rituals of the moon because Buzz Aldrin was a high-ranking Freemason? Not really. I mean, to become a high-ranking Freemason like him, you really have to sign up to your local lodge, go to a series of lectures, and in a weekend, more or less, in the United States, and here in the UK it's a bit different, but more or less in a weekend, you get 32nd degree. He was 33rd. You're gonna be a little bit longer there, but that's about it, right? There's nothing else. There's no secret cabal really running Freemasonry. So yeah, I hope I didn't I didn't destroy your expectations too much, but that's the truth of the matter. And I know Peter
No,
has
no, no,
known.
not at all. I mean, I really appreciate that because so much has been written about that as a rumor or like a almost like a proven myth, and
Yeah,
I've
I
always
know.
been interested in that, but I've never focused on that in any of my storytelling. So it's really cool that you kind of debunked that.
Like I said, like definitely look into George Pendle's Strange Angel because you will get to know who Jack Parsons actually was and how much he was involved in magic. And he really was involved in magic. He was doing strange rituals in the desert,
Yeah.
even during his experiments with rockets. But that
Hmm.
was him, and he got him fired. That's the reality of it, right?
Darcy, I don't know if you've ever caught Kelly Chaser's podcast. She does a bit of a deep dive into Parsons. It was quite early on in her series, but it was really good. I enjoyed it as someone who's sort of studied this stuff. It definitely gave me a little bit more. I'm quite conscious of time, and there is a significant amount of requests to come up. We have took quite a lot of Marco and Peter's time, and I did want to get to Frank and Paul and Tiff.
Quickly,
And I
Holly.
think we're probably going to have to. Sorry,
Quickly,
John?
Holly. Yeah, sorry. Matthew was one of the first people
He
to put up
sure
their hand.
was. Matthew, where are
Yeah.
you?
Yeah, well, he had dropped down to the audience. Hopefully, he'll come back up because I think we should definitely let him ask a
Yeah,
question.
that you're completely right, Matthew. I'm going to send you an invite to speak. I'm sorry, that was my bad. As he's coming up, should we? Frank, did you have a question for Marco? Frank, you there, my love?
Sorry about that. My phone kept messing up, so I had to keep dropping down.
Don't worry, Matthew. I'm sorry we kept you waiting for so long. It's just been a really awesome space, and well, you've been listening.
Yeah.
So fire away with your question, Matthew. Thank you for being so patient.
Yeah, so I had a question for Peter. First of all, I was on the Theodore Roosevelt for the Gimbal event. I was in the Navy, and I subsequently worked at O&I after that. And your books were a huge part of my own initiation with non-human intelligences. So I just wanted to say thank you for that. But one of my questions is, I wonder if you have any insights into, mystery schools of ancient Greece and all of these other ancient cultures that had mystery schools. Why was there the secrecy that there was surrounding those schools? And is it comparable to the kind of secrecy today we have around the UFO phenomenon? I wonder if you have any insight on that. Thanks.
Thank you, and thank you for your comments. I'm glad that my books had some effect that way. The mystery schools, of course, we don't know enough about them because they were mystery schools, and so not a lot of what they were doing was kept in writing, or we don't really know a lot of the rituals. The rites of Alephsis, for instance, we really don't have very much data on that. The rites of Mithra, the same thing. We have kind of an idea about it. I have my own ideas about it, but we don't have enough in writing to say, okay, this is what they actually did. So why was there secrecy? Well, couple of reasons. One would be quite obviously that they were doing things they didn't want anybody else to know. But possibly also the secrecy is an integral part of this process because even the old saw, to know, to will, to dare, and to keep silent. Those four, that adage of the four commandments there of magicians. To keep silent is one of them. The idea is that if you talk too much about things, if you reveal too much about what's going on, it becomes open to all sorts of critique by people who did not go through it. If you go through a ritual initiation, for instance, the other people that know about it are the people who've been through it. You have something in common with them. You can discuss it, and you can discuss it intelligently. If someone has not gone through it, you have a very hard time discussing it intelligently, and you were in the service. So you know that if you try to discuss what happened to you, if you were in combat, for instance, trying to discuss that to someone who was not is really impossible. You can kind of give the general outlines of things, but the experience will never be shared. The only shared experience is the one that you can really communicate. So one of the real reasons for secrecy, I believe, is that. Otherwise, it dilutes the experience completely. You waste a lot of time trying to accommodate other people's wrong perceptions and speculations, really, about what you've done, and try to explain it and try to defend it and all the rest of it, and the whole experience is devalued. So the secrecy is there for that reason. It can be abused, obviously. There can be, secrecy that's only kept, there so that it keeps the the hierarchy in place so they're not challenged. So there's a political aspect to secrecy as well. I think Hugh Urban has written about that a lot. He writes about religion, secrecy, and occultism as well in this framework of secrecy. So I think secrecy has a lot, to do. Things are consecrated in secret. In the grimoires, it's kind of a truism that after you've done the ritual of blessing a sword or a wand or something, you wrap it up and you bury it somewhere. You keep it out of sight for a long period of time. The power becomes imbued in that period when no one's looking at it, no one's touching it, in that period of secrecy. It's like a fetus in the womb. It cannot be seen, directly. So there are all kinds of reasons for secrecy. And like I say, we called our books with Tom the Secret Machines, because secrecy for us had all kinds of valences, all kinds of dimensions as a concept. It wasn't just, I know something you don't know. It's more of the mystery, something that cannot be communicated, even if you try. So I think that's one of the reasons why secrecy was so important in these groups.
Thanks, Peter. We've got Paul, then Tiff, and then I'm so sorry for everybody else that is requesting. We were due to finish some time ago, and I'm very conscious of Marco and Peter's time. Hopefully, this won't be the last time we can get them into a space. Hopefully, we can do more further down the line. So, Paul, you had a question for Marco or Peter, or both?
Yeah. Thanks, Holly, and thanks, John, and of course, Marco and Peter for being here. This has been just a fabulous conversation. I also saw you speak, Peter, at the Inquire Anomalous conference last spring, and that was great. It was fantastic meeting you. So, yeah, I've been loving this conversation, loving the discussion of H.P. Lovecraft earlier. My background is mostly in literature and the arts. And I was just kind of curious. So, Peter, you gave a little shout out to the great TV show Twin Peaks during your interview with Whitley Strieber recently, and I was very curious on just your thoughts as to why you think that's a good show for the uninitiated, and also just curious if you had any thoughts about H.P. Lovecraft and his connection to the occult or anomalous phenomena, because I just, as an example, his story "Dreams in the Witch House," I think evokes a lot when it comes to the sort of contact modalities that are discussed within these fields. So, yeah, if you just wanted to speak to that at all, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Great question. And that one about Twin Peaks was on the tip of my tongue. So thanks, Paul.
Thank you. Yes, Twin Peaks. I'm one of those people who fell in love with it immediately. Saw all of it, saw the movie, saw the 25-year version of it. I mean, I'm completely a David Lynch fan, so that's one issue right there. But why Twin Peaks in particular? Twin Peaks is about a crime that takes place, which has resonances in so many different dimensions. It's I mean, Sinister Forces, which was the first. After Unholy Alliance, I had that trilogy, Sinister Forces, which is all about, people think I'm a conspiracy theorist because I wrote about conspiracies, but that was not the point of the book, but be that as it may. But Sinister Forces talks about the weird, anomalous stuff that surrounds very important political events, like the Kennedy assassination, for instance, or like the Charles Manson killings and the Son of Sam stuff and everything else. I kept seeing all this anomalous stuff. I mean, I got into the UFO field because I was researching the Kennedy assassination, right? And I found out that, Guy Bannister was the guy researching, following up and investigating all the UFO sightings in the Pacific Northwest in 1947, from Kenneth Arnold to Fred Krisman and Maury Island and all of that stuff, and was reporting directly back to Hoover, J. Edgar Hoover, on this, right? And then he turns up in New Orleans in the same, running this detective agency where Lee Harvey Oswald is there printing his Fair Play for Cuba literature, and David Ferry and Jack Martin and the whole crowd. And I'm thinking, what? Guy Bannister of, the famous guy from the Kennedy assassination, Jim Garrison, was investigating the Bannister associations, and he was investigating Fred Krisman because he thought Fred Krisman was involved in the assassination. where Fred Krisman was the key player in Maury Island, that famous weird UFO incident that also took place at the same time as Roswell in 1947, that was being investigated by Guy Bannister. It's like, that's Twin Peaks, isn't it? You have a murder, and you have suddenly all these UFO connections. You have the Black Lodge, for crying out loud, right? I mean, you have weird bishops, and you had the Nine, Arthur Young and Ruth Forbes Payne Young, and the connections to Oswald and Ruth Payne in Dallas. I mean, it was Twin Peaks. I mean, if you had taken the Twin Peaks and just made it about the American political experience of the last 50 years, it would have made just as much sense. So yeah, I think that Twin Peaks enables us, gives us the way of looking at, allows us to see these connections. And for Lynch, it was like a work of art, but art is also very deceptive. Art can be revolutionary. Art can be subversive. And I think Lynch's Twin Peaks is kind of subversive. He focuses on the small American towns, and he focuses on all the weird, strange, potentially evil, certainly dark things that happen there. And if you take that and you just, expand it to include the whole country, because I write in Sinister Forces that the United States of America is a haunted house. It's a haunted house. It's been inhabited by ghosts. We showed up, and there's just, we've had Native Americans of all different kinds living here. We've had possibly people from Africa having sailed over, according to some people. We've had people living here for thousands and thousands of years before the Europeans showed up, and we blithely walked through all of their major, monuments, the earthworks, the famous mounds everywhere. Charlie Manson grew up in a town with the Adena Mounds as part of their park in the center of the town. I mean, weird connections like that really got me, really thinking about it. And as I'm writing it, as I'm collecting information for Sinister Forces, there's Twin Peaks, which is basically telling me my story back to me. And it was just, this is an incredible thing. And I just realized it recently, having watched the 25th year, the television episodes again for the second time, rewatching it and realizing, oh my God, this is what Sinister Forces was all about. This is what I've been writing about, and this is why nobody could quite understand it. They would always come back to me at Sinister Forces and say, "What are you talking about?" And I'm saying, well, I can't tell you what it is, because that's the whole point. These are sinister forces. These are dark forces at work. They seem to violate the laws of space and time, but they're definitely there. The anomalies are strong. They're there. We don't know what they mean. And that got me into the UFO field as well.
And you know what? It's very interesting because you mentioned that you got so inspired by Twin Peaks. I watched Twin Peaks as well when it came out, and I was 12 years of age.
That's
So you can
me.
imagine what did to me at the time, right? And exactly what you said. Like it's a show that pretty much shows you directly that doesn't matter where you are, doesn't matter how mundane your life might seem, there's always the other waiting just like a step in the dark in front of you. And we're surrounded by that. It's a human experience. And we should try and make sense of it, and knowing that in the dark there be something might be predatory, right? There might be something dangerous out there, but at the same time it's out there, and we cannot we cannot deny it, we cannot ignore it. So yeah.
That's
So
great. Oh,
thank you.
sorry. Thank you. Yeah, there's something dark living in these woods for sure. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Paul. Tiffany, my love, you are our last question of the day.
Thank you so much. Wonderful space. Your wonderful speakers as well. Very interesting. I wanted to get your opinion on apocalyptic visions. I feel my experience in the phenomenon is a download experience of like a cataclysmic vision and some reseeding. And I have, upon divulging that, I've learned it's not uncommon for people to have these visions of Earth cycles and cataclysms. What's your take on that regarding the phenomenon?
Okay, I'll make a brief answer to that. If I'm capable of making a brief answer, I'll try. This will be a first. They never show up since recorded history. I'm talking about since biblical times. No prophet ever shows up and says, God told me You guys are doing great. Keep it up. No prophet has ever said, everything's fine. I like what you guys are doing. Keep doing what you're doing. All is good. They never do they? They always show up and say, oh my God, the world's going to end. Every prophet, Isaiah in the Bible, Jeremiah, they're all telling you things are terrible, things are falling apart. You have to. We're at the end of the world. It's going to happen at any moment, and you've got to get your act together and do something. Why is it that nobody ever shows up and tells us we're doing a great job? Obviously, one answer is we're not doing a great job, but we've been here for thousands of years, and maybe we've made the planet a worse place. You can make a very solid argument for that. Maybe we haven't learned as much as we're supposed to learn spiritually, for sure. Our technology has outpaced us as far as our spiritual growth is concerned. All of these things are true, but we never get an attaboy from either the aliens or from our divine prophets or anybody. They're always telling us the world's going to end. They've been doing that for thousands of years. What is that? I'd like to know myself. I don't have an answer for you. It's one of these things that perplexes me all the time. And I brought this up, occasionally. I just don't understand it. I don't understand why we don't get somebody telling us, okay, this is what you have to do. You're on the right path, but now you have to do this, or now you have to do that. There's never any very helpful information, right? We don't get any helpful information. We get warnings all the time, but we never get somebody saying, this is my advice, do it this way. Don't know.
Well,
You know,
catastrophe I'm referring to is like cyclical, though, like uh extinction level events like flood kind of so humanity itself may be problematic, but what about like extinction level events? If there's an uptick in apocalyptic visions and it's directly associated with the phenomenon, as that's how it's being conveyed.
Well, this is my point. I don't know if this is deliberate. Like, I don't know if I don't understand what the motivation is, because the phenomenon, people who've been contacted have been getting this type of information for a long time. They see the world ending, they see cataclysms, they see all this stuff going on, and they always see it. And what does it mean, really? Maybe it's just, they've been contacted by somebody with a bad case of digestion, or I don't know. They're communicating something horrible. And yes, extinction level, absolutely. But what are we supposed to do with that information? Why abduct us? Why abduct innocent people? I'm assuming we're innocent. Abducting innocent people and then giving them this download of these horrible images and then walking away. It's like, okay, now what? Tell me what to do, right? Is there anything to do? Can I bury a hole and hide myself? I mean, what is it we're supposed to do? This is the thing. This is when people talk about the aliens as our space brothers and they're beneficent, they're angelic. There are certain people whose names I won't mention, like Marco won't mention, who are out there selling that story. That don't worry about it. Everything is fine.
I cannot mention it. Damn it.
But it's like, where's the proof? When have they ever stopped a war? When have they ever? I don't know, something, right? Even this guy from Falun Gong, Li Hongzhi, he says, they gave us computers and machinery and technology and all this stuff, and they're trying to replace us. They want us to be extinct. I mean, seriously, So these are the good guys. What do the bad guys look like? So I don't know how to answer you. I feel for you, really, because I read these accounts, but there's always like, and I'm waiting for the and then what? And there's never and then what? There's never a conclusion. There's never anything to do with that material. I don't know where to put it. And maybe I'm just.
You know what? If I may, maybe offer like a way of reading into it, right? If you look at these visions, right, like these cataclysmic visions, has from the initiatory lens, right? In initiation, before you can really embark onto this process of transmutation, you have to go alchemically to what is called the nigredo phase, the destruction phase, the putrefaction. Okay, you have to dissolve yourself by yourself. You must be willing to go into what's called the athanor, the flames of purification, in order to, well, to give your inner gold the chance to come up to the surface. Maybe if we look at these visions that appears alongside the appearance of the phenomenon, in history, maybe it's a constant reminder of the hardship of initiation, and maybe that's what they're there to propel us to do, right? They're forcing us through it's think about it, ad astra per aspera, to the stars through hardships. Well, that's what it is, right? We have to go through the hardships first if we want to reach to the stars. But then again, this is maybe being a little bit too optimistic for once.
That's the word I was going to use, Marco. You're being very optimistic. Yeah, maybe. You could be very well be right. But isn't there a time when they should tell us that that's what the point is, rather than just saying apocalypse now?
Yeah, that never happens. That's true.
Guys, thank you ever so much. This has been an enlightening and informative. I didn't even know the right words, which is unlike me because I'm very, very wordy. But from me, thank you both so much for taking time out of your busy schedules and lives to join us.